February 23, 1945. Los Barras internment camp, Philippines. The sun rises over barbed wire, and the skeletal frames of women who have learned to move slowly to conserve what little energy their bodies still hold. For 3 years, they have lived in a world stripped of sound. No radios, no records, no music beyond what they could hum in secret after the guards passed. The silence became another kind of prison, as suffocating as the heat, as relentless as the hunger. Then, in the distance, a low rumble. Not the familiar drone of Japanese patrols. Something else. Engines, American engines. The sound grows closer, and with it, something impossible. A melody drifting through the smoke and chaos of liberation. A song they haven't heard in years. A voice from home, carried on radio waves across an ocean and 3 years of captivity. Some of them stand frozen. Others collapse where they stand, hands covering their faces, shoulders shaking. They are crying, not from fear, not from relief alone, but from the sudden, overwhelming proof that the world they thought they had lost still exists. December 8, 1941. Hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces launched their assault on the Philippines. The islands, a vital American territory in the Pacific, held thousands of military personnel, civilians, missionaries, teachers, and nurses. Within weeks, the coordinated invasion overwhelmed defenses. Manila fell on January 2, 1942. Corregidor, the island fortress in Manila Bay, held out until May, when it surrendered. The United States lost not just strategic ground, but thousands of its people. Among them was 77 Army and Navy nurses stationed at hospitals in Manila and Corregidor. They had worked through bombing raids, treating the wounded in underground tunnels with dwindling medical supplies. When the order came to surrender, they became prisoners. Alongside them were hundreds of American and Allied civilian women, wives of servicemen, teachers at missionary schools, businesswomen who had built lives in Manila before the war arrived. Entire communities were swept into captivity. The Japanese military established internment camps across the occupied Philippines. Santo Tomas internment camp, located on the campus of a university in Manila, became the largest. Over 3,000 civilians were imprisoned there behind high walls and barbed wire. Los Barras, 50 miles south, held another 2,000. There were smaller camps scattered across the islands, each one a sealed world where the outside ceased to exist. Inside these camps, the rules were absolute. No radios, no newspapers, no communication with the outside world. The Japanese guards controlled all information, all movement, all access to anything beyond the wire. The women were cut off not just from their country, but from any proof that it still fought, still existed, still remembered them. The first year passed in disorientation. The women organized themselves. Nurses ran makeshift clinics. Teachers held classes for imprisoned children. Committees formed to manage food distribution and sanitation. They clung to routines as a form of resistance, a way to maintain identity in a place designed to erase it. But as months became years, the camps deteriorated. Food rations shrank. Red Cross packages, when they arrived at all, were looted before reaching the prisoners. Dysentery, malaria, and beriberi spread through crowded barracks. Bodies weakened. By 1944, the average daily ration had dropped below 900 calories. Women who once weighed 130 pounds now weighed 80. Worse than the hunger was the isolation. No letters reached them. No news of the war's progress penetrated the walls. Japanese guards told them America had surrendered, that the war was over, that no one was coming. Some believed it. Others held on to faith through sheer will, but doubt crept in during the long, silent nights. They had no way to know that across the Pacific, Allied forces were island-hopping toward them, that liberation fleets were being assembled, that their names had not been forgotten. Music disappeared entirely. In the early months, some women had sung together quietly, hymns, folk songs, anything to hear familiar melodies, but the guards forbade it. Singing drew punishment, humming drew suspicion. The camps became places of enforced silence, where even the memory of sound felt dangerous to hold on to. Music had always been a thread connecting them to home, to normalcy, to the lives they had lived before captivity. Its absence became another form of loss, subtle but corrosive. By late 1944, the women at Los Barrios and Santo Tomas were surviving on hope they could barely articulate. They did not know that American forces had landed in Leyte in October. They did not know that MacArthur had returned. They did not know that liberation was weeks away, moving toward them through jungles and beachheads. They knew only the reality inside the wire, the hunger, the silence, the slow erasure of everything that had once made them who they were. Angle 1. The nurses' 77 Army and Navy nurses captured in the Philippines were not supposed to be prisoners of war. They were supposed to have been evacuated before the Japanese closed in. But orders came too late, or not at all, and they found themselves trapped. Lieutenant Josephine Nesbitt, chief nurse at Sternberg Hospital in Manila, watched her staff transition from treating wounded soldiers to becoming captives themselves. At Santo Tomas, the nurses were placed in a separate section, their medical skills too valuable to waste. They ran the camp hospital with almost nothing, no anesthesia, no antibiotics, improvised bandages from torn clothing. They delivered babies in barracks. They held the hands of dying prisoners. They maintained discipline and dignity, even their own bodies withered. Captain Maud Davison led the Navy nurses captured on Corregidor. She enforced strict routines among her staff, uniforms to be kept as clean as possible, military bearing to be maintained, morale to be projected even when privately crumbling. The nurses became symbols of endurance to other prisoners, but the cost was invisible. They absorbed trauma daily, watching patients die from treatable infections, witnessing the slow starvation of people they could not save. Some kept journals hidden in their clothing. Others stopped writing, fearing the words would betray how close they were to breaking. Angle 2. The civilians. Not all the women wore uniforms. Margaret Shirk had been a missionary teacher in Manila for 12 years before the invasion. She spoke Tagalog fluently, had Filipino students she considered family, and watched them disappear when the Japanese occupied the city. At Santo Tomas, she organized secret classes for imprisoned children, teaching math and history from memory, because textbooks were forbidden. Sasha Weinsheimer, a Russian-born concert pianist married to an American engineer, had performed across Manila's social circles before the war. In the camp, her hands grew too weak to play imaginary keys. Music lived only in her memory, a library of sound she could not access. Hundreds of women fell into this category, ordinary lives interrupted by war, wives who had followed their husbands to the Philippines for work, businesswomen who ran shops in Manila, mothers raising children in what had seemed like a distant, safe corner of the American world. When the camps formed, they discovered how fragile that safety had been. They adapted, forming committees, organizing food lines, negotiating with guards over rations and medical supplies. But the work of survival left little room for the identities they once held. Angle 3. Psychological survivalry became an act of resistance. In the barracks at night, women whispered stories of home to each other, descriptions of Thanksgiving dinners, the layout of childhood kitchens, the smell of rain in autumn. These rituals were not nostalgia. They were survival tools, ways to keep the mind anchored to an identity the camp tried to strip away. Dr. Dana Nance, a missionary doctor imprisoned at Santo Tomas, later described how prisoners developed techniques to preserve sanity. Some recited poetry from memory. Others walked imaginary routes through hometowns, block by block, rebuilding geography in their heads. Music held particular power. Even when forbidden, it persisted in fragments. A woman might hum a melody under her breath while washing clothes in a communal basin. Another might tap out a rhythm or a wooden beam, just enough to hear pattern in the silence. Small groups gathered in corners of the compound after dark, singing hymns in voices barely above a whisper, stopping instantly if footsteps approached. These moments were acts of defiance, but also acts of memory maintenance. To sing was to prove to themselves that they still knew the words, still carried the internal library of sound that defined who they had been before captivity. The Japanese guards understood this. Music was banned not because it was loud, but because it was connective. A shared song created solidarity. A familiar melody reminded prisoners they belonged to something beyond the wire. Silence, enforced and absolute, was a tool of control as deliberate as hunger. Angle 4. The power of sound. Sound carries identity in ways vision cannot. A voice, a song, an accent. These are imprints of origin, proof of belonging. For the imprisoned women, years without American music meant years without auditory confirmation that their country still existed. They could remember songs, but memory fades. It distorts. Without the actual sound, doubt crept in. Had they forgotten the words, the melody? Were their memories reliable, or had captivity warped even that? Music also marks time. The women had been cut off from the world in 1942. They did not know what songs were popular in 1943, 1944, 1945. They did not know if Glenn Miller was still performing, if Frank Sinatra had become famous, if the Andrews Sisters were singing for troops overseas. Their internal soundtrack was frozen at the moment of capture. The world of sound had moved on without them, and they had no way to catch up. This disconnection was isolating in a way that transcended physical imprisonment. They were not just separated from America by distance. They were separated by time, by culture, by every new song written and performed, while they lived in enforced silence. When liberation came, music would not just be entertainment. It would be evidence, proof that the world they remembered was real, that home was not a fading dream, but a place still producing sound, still alive, still waiting for them to return. February 3, 1945, Santo Tomas. The distant rumble of artillery had been growing 4 days, but the guards insisted it was nothing. Japanese radio broadcasts claimed victories, retreats that were actually strategic withdrawals, phantom armies that did not exist. Then, at dusk, the sound changed. Tank engines, American tank engines, unmistakable in their deep, mechanical growl. The 1st Cavalry Division smashed through the front gates of Santo Tomas. Just after 9 p.m. soldiers poured into the compound. Prisoners stumbled out of barracks, skeletal and disbelieving. Some laughed, some screamed. Many simply stood frozen, unable to process what their eyes were seeing. The Japanese guards retreated to the education building, taking 200 prisoners hostage for a final standoff. Negotiations lasted through the night, but in the main compound, liberation had already begun. American soldiers distributed rations, set up field hospitals, and tried to comprehend the condition of the people they had just freed. Captain Robert Whitman, who entered with the first wave, later described the silence that fell over his unit when they saw the prisoners up close. Faces like skulls, bodies that barely supported their own weight, eyes that looked through him, as if seeing something beyond the present moment. Then someone turned on a radio. It had been brought in with the supply trucks, a standard field unit capable of picking up armed forces radio. Static crackled, then cleared. Music poured out. American music, broadcast from somewhere across the Pacific, traveling through the air to reach this compound that had been silent for 3 years. The first song was a big band number, brassy and bright, the kind of sound that had filled dance halls and living rooms across America, while these women starved behind wire. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Women collapsed to their knees. Others clutched each other, sobbing into shoulders that had no flesh left to cushion the grief pouring out. Lieutenant Laura Cobb, one of the army nurses, stood perfectly still with tears streaming down her face, her mouth moving silently as if trying to remember how to form words. Dr. Mary Rose Harrington, a civilian internee, later recalled hearing the Andrews Sisters singing "Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree" and feeling her knees buckle, not from weakness, though she weighed 79 pounds, from the sudden, unbearable proof that the world she remembered was real. February 23, 1945, Los Barras. 20 days after Santo Tomas, the operation to liberate this camp required precision. Los Barras sat behind enemy lines, surrounded by Japanese forces that could massacre the prisoners before any ground assault reached them. The plan combined airborne troops, amphibious landings, and guerrilla forces in a coordinated dawn raid. At 7 a.m., C-47 transport planes roared overhead. Paratroopers from the 11th Airborne Division dropped directly onto the camp perimeter. Gunfire erupted. The raid lasted 17 minutes. Inside the barracks, the women had heard planes before, always Japanese, always a source of dread. But these engines sounded different. Then the parachutes appeared, white canopies blossoming against the morning sky. Amtraks, amphibious tractors, crashed through the fence from the nearby lake. Guerrilla fighters emerged from the jungle. The camp exploded into chaos. Prisoners were ordered to evacuate immediately. No time to gather belongings. No time to process what was happening. They were herded toward the Amtraks, lifted into the vehicles by soldiers who tried not to react to how little these bodies weighed. As the convoy moved toward safety, one of the Amtraks carried a portable radio. A young soldier, Private Eugene Parker, had rigged it to run off the vehicle's battery. He turned it on, searching for a signal. Static, then voices. An armed forces radio broadcast, music interspersed with news updates. The first clear song that came through was Bing Crosby's "I'll Be Home for Christmas." The lyrics cut through the noise of engines and distant gunfire. Margaret Nash, a missionary nurse who had weighed 120 pounds in 1942 and now weighed 78, heard the song and started crying so hard she couldn't breathe. Other women reached for her, their own faces wet, their voices making sounds that weren't quite words. Dorothy Still, a teacher from California, pressed her hands over her ears, then pulled them away, as if she couldn't decide whether the music was too painful to hear or too precious to block out. The soldier with the radio looked stricken, unsure whether he'd done something wrong. But the women weren't crying from pain. They were crying because for 3 years, they had heard nothing but camp sounds, guards shouting, metal gates clanging, the shuffle of malnourished feet on dirt. They had lived in a sonic void where every familiar sound had been erased. And now, carried through the air from transmitters thousands of miles away, came proof that America still sang, that orchestras still played, that someone, somewhere, was recording music and broadcasting it to troops fighting across the Pacific, which meant the war was still being fought, which meant they had not been abandoned, which meant the world had not stopped while they were imprisoned. The music didn't erase 3 years of trauma. It didn't restore the weight they'd lost or heal the diseases ravaging their bodies, but it gave them something they had been starved of even more than food, evidence that the life they remembered was still real, still reachable, still theirs to return to. The rescued women were evacuated to field hospitals, then transported to bases in Leyte and eventually back to the United States. Medical examinations revealed the systematic destruction captivity had inflicted. The average weight loss among the nurses was 40 to 50 pounds. Civilian women fared worse. Some had lost more than 60 pounds from already smaller frames. Malnutrition had caused beriberi, pellagra, and scurvy. Dental infections had gone untreated for years. Tropical diseases, malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, persisted in their systems. Doctors documented edema, muscle atrophy, liver damage, and neurological symptoms from prolonged vitamin deficiencies, but the physical damage was measurable. The psychological impact was not. In 1945, there was no formal diagnosis for post-traumatic stress disorder. The concept didn't exist in military medicine yet. Psychiatrists noted symptoms: insomnia, hypervigilance, flashbacks, severe anxiety around food scarcity, but had no framework to treat them. Many of the women were simply declared physically recovered and sent home, expected to resume their lives as if 3 years could be surgically removed from memory. Some adapted through silence. They didn't talk about the camps, didn't attend reunions, didn't acknowledge what had happened except in the quietest corners of their minds. Others couldn't stop talking, compulsively recounting details to anyone who would listen, as if repetition might finally make the experience make sense. Lieutenant Josephine Nesbitt, who had led the army nurses through captivity, returned to active duty, but resigned within 2 years. The reasons listed in her file were vague. Those who knew her understood. Music remained a trigger for many. Certain songs, the ones that had played during liberation, or the ones they'd sung in secret during imprisonment, could provoke immediate tears or panic attacks. Dorothy still couldn't listen to Bing Crosby for decades without feeling her throat close. Others sought out those same songs obsessively, playing them on repeats as if trying to reclaim the moment when sound had proven they were free. The nurses who returned were celebrated as heroes, paraded through cities, interviewed by newspapers, but the attention felt hollow to many of them. They had survived, yes, but survival was not triumph. It was simply the absence of death. Captain Maud Davison received the Legion of Merit for her leadership at Santo Tomas. She accepted it with grace, then retreated from public life. In private letters, she admitted the camps had broken something inside her that decorations couldn't repair. The civilian women faced a different struggle. They had no military structure to return to, no veteran networks, no official recognition of what they had endured. Many found their homes had been sold, their possessions discarded, their pre-war lives dismantled by families who had assumed they were dead. Margaret Shirk returned to find her missionary organization had reassigned her position. Sasha Weinsheimer sat at a piano for the first time in 4 years and found her hands shaking too badly to play. She never performed publicly again. Survivor networks formed slowly. In the 1950s, small reunions began, gatherings where the women could speak openly without needing to explain. They shared strategies for managing nightmares, for navigating a world that moved too fast and expected too much. They talked about food, the obsession with it, the guilt around wasting it, the way abundance still felt dangerous. And they talked about sound, how certain noises, gates slamming, voices shouting in unfamiliar languages, the absence of music, could pull them back into the camps instantly, viscerally, as if liberation had never happened. Some of the women lived into their 80s and 90s, long enough to see their stories documented by historians, long enough to be interviewed for oral history projects and documentaries. When asked what they remembered most about liberation, many returned to the same moment. Not the gates opening, not the sight of American uniforms, but the music, the sudden, impossible sound of home reaching them through years of silence. The moment they heard it and knew, finally, that they had survived not just the camps, but the erasure the camps had tried to impose. They had been heard, they had been remembered, and the world they belonged to had never stopped singing. Music is more than entertainment. It is proof of existence, a sonic fingerprint of culture and identity. For the women imprisoned in the Philippines, years without it meant years, without confirmation that the world they came from still lived. Memory can fade, hope can falter, but sound, actual sound, carried through the air and received by the ear, is undeniable evidence. When they heard American music again, they were not simply hearing songs. They were hearing proof that orchestras still gathered, that studios still recorded, that radios still broadcast across oceans. They were hearing the continuation of a culture they had been severed from. In that moment, captivity ended not just physically, but existentially. They were no longer isolated. They were reconnected. The tears were not weakness. They were recognition. The overwhelming, uncontrollable response to being found again, to being pulled back into the stream of life that had flowed on without them. Music gave them what no military operation could, the sound of home, undeniable and immediate, reaching across distance and time to say, "You are not forgotten. You are still one of us. Welcome back." In the vastness of war, in the machinery of strategy and the calculus of casualties, it is easy to overlook the small human moments that carry the most weight. But for those women, liberation was not complete until they heard the first notes of a familiar song. That was the moment they knew they had truly survived.